Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode, where we'll be exploring chilling true cruise ships horror stories. These are tales from the open sea, where isolation and unexpected encounters have left passengers with unforgettable memories. But before starting the video, please consider giving us a like. Also, if you have any terrifying or unnerving experiences of your own, feel free to reach out and share your story with us. Who knows, it might even be featured in one of our future episodes. This took place 15 years ago when I was around 19. At the time, I worked on cargo ships, carrying goods across the sea, and I was still getting used to life on board. The ship I was working on was about 30 years old, although that might not sound too old. If you work in a similar job, you'll understand how it feels to be the young, new guy on an all-male crew. Most of them had lived and worked together for months or even years. You feel like an outsider and have to show that you're good at your job. Also, you should expect a lot of practical jokes from the others. So when I joined the ship, the crew started talking about a ghost on board, and they asked me if I believed in ghosts, and I said no, even though that wasn't true because I had strange experiences before. Then, about a week after I got on board, I heard a loud knock on my cabin door. I had my own cabin, but it was small and in the middle of the living area, with no window. I opened the door, but no one was there, so I thought someone was playing a prank on me. This started happening often, at different times, and sometimes it woke me up with 3 loud knocks. Each time, I would jump up and open the door as fast as I could to catch whoever it was, but I never saw anyone or even heard them running away. My cabin was about in the middle of a corridor that was around 20 meters long, so I had to run about 10 meters to get around a corner. A few times, I felt like I had opened the door fast enough that I should have seen someone, but there was no one in the lobby. So this made me wonder if it was someone in a nearby cabin. I asked about the people in the cabins next to mine. There was an old man in one cabin who was in his 60s. I'd seen him around, but he always moved slowly, so I didn't think he could be the one knocking on my door. The other cabins were empty. On older ships like this one, it's common to have extra cabins because they were designed to hold more crew members. However, these days, ships often sail with fewer crew members, so many cabins stay unused. The knocking kept happening until one day when I was at my wardrobe, hanging up my shirt right next to the cabin door. Suddenly there was a knock. I opened the door so quickly that I expected to see someone standing there, but the corridor was empty. And that's when I realized something strange was happening. So now I began to pay more attention to what other people were saying, and I also noticed a heavy feeling on board. I had been on 2 ships before this one, and sailed on 4 more after it, but none of them felt like this. On those ships, there was usually a sense of camaraderie among the crew, and everyone seemed relaxed. But on this ship, it felt different, like something was off. Things got worse after that. One of my jobs at night was to walk around the ship to check that the cargo was secured and that there were no problems. I would take a radio with me so I could contact the bridge if I needed help. Sometimes the radio would suddenly blast loud static for no reason. When I called the officer on the bridge to ask if they had said something, they would come back and say no, and they didn't hear any static at all. And this happened with multiple radios, so it wasn't just one broken radio. Then one day while I was doing my rounds in the laundry at 2 a.m., an alarm went off, I turned around and saw the watertight door closing behind me. I radioed the bridge to ask if they were closing it, which would be unusual because the door is usually only operated during test or emergencies. The second mate replied no. And not only that, his console also showed that the door was still open. The door closed completely, and the second mate radioed to tell me to try to open it manually, because he couldn't do it from the bridge since it still showed as open. I used the lever to override the door and opened it. I radioed the mate to let him know, and he said he would have the engineers check it out. I continued with my rounds, but when I got to the next door, the alarm went off and it started closing again. I radioed the mate, and he said he wasn't doing anything, so I would have to override it again. This time I managed to get the door open, but as soon as it was fully open, it started closing again. I looked around and saw that the other door was also closing, and I realized I was getting trapped in the laundry. I felt a sense of panic, and then the lights began to flicker, and static blasted over the radio. I jumped through the closing door, which was a really bad idea because it could crush me, and then I hurried out of that area. Now theoretically, it could have been a coincidence with the failing systems, or someone playing tricks. The doors can be controlled from the bridge, but no one would play a prank like that since the doors can be dangerous. Also, when the door started closing, no one would have known I was there. The next day, they did a full test on the watertight doors and found no problems. I should mention that each watertight door is controlled by its own system, so if one fails, the others usually do not. This means that having two doors fail at the same time would be very unlikely. Then another night I did my usual late night rounds and reported back to the bridge when I finished. When I got there, the second mate looked very pale and was shaking. He was holding a cup of tea that was sloshing around because his hand was shaking so much. I asked if he was okay, but he could barely speak. Finally, he managed to tell me that he was sitting in front of the radar screen 5 minutes earlier when he heard me come back to the bridge. He asked if everything was okay, but I didn't respond. He looked over his shoulder to see me, but instead, he saw an old man, pale and wide-eyed, staring at him from just an arm's length away. Then out of nowhere, the old man disappeared right in front of his eyes. The second mate was crying as he told me this, and he was usually a tough guy. My worst experience happened in my cabin. I had been on board for about 3 months by that point, and had kind of accepted that I was stuck on this strange ship. I think some of the fear had faded, because you get used to feeling on edge. So by this point, I ignored the knocking on my door, and it might have even stopped happening, but I don't remember. Anyway, one night I got into bed, read for a bit, and then turned off the light. As soon as I turned off the light, I thought I saw a figure standing over the bed, but it was almost completely dark, so I couldn't see any details. After I jumped in surprise, I told myself not to be silly, and figured it was just my eyes adjusting to the dark. Then the figure sat down on the bed, squashing my legs, and turning its head toward me. I can already hear you thinking it was sleep paralysis, but I have experienced that before, and I know it wasn't. I could move my arms and upper body just fine, but my lower legs felt trapped under something heavy. It was like a weight pressing down on them. I was desperately pulling at the blanket, trying to dislodge the thing and free my legs, but it felt impossible. Panic started to rise in me as I realized I wasn't dreaming. I was fully awake and unable to escape this strange presence. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on my forehead. I tried to reach for the light switch, but it was a few inches too far away. I started swinging my hands at the spot where the figure should have been, but I didn't hit anything. Then finally, the figure stood up, and I could move my legs again. I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. I couldn't sleep without a nightlight after that, even for a long time after I left the ship. Every little noise would make me nervous, and I'd wake up scared, remembering all those weird things that had happened. The feeling of fear stayed with me, and it was hard to feel safe in the dark. This took place about a year ago, when I was working as a second officer on a heavy lifting ship. It was my job to keep watch and make sure everything was running smoothly, especially during the night shifts. We were crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and it was a quiet, dark night with only the sound of the waves. The scariest thing I ever experienced at sea happened during one of these routine night shifts. So I was walking around the bridge console to get some exercise and help pass the time while on watch. I was the second officer from midnight to 4 a.m. As I made my way past the bridge windows, I noticed someone outside, walking from the back of the ship toward the front on the starboard side. Seeing someone there wasn't strange in itself, but considering it was 1:30 a.m., it felt unusual. The ship was usually quiet at that hour, and most of the crew would be resting. The crew was allowed to go outside whenever they wanted, so at first I didn't think much of it. But when I walked past the window again after a full lap, I noticed the person standing still between cargo hold number 1 and the windbreaker, facing forward with his back to me. I stopped to see what he was doing, and suddenly he turned around and looked straight at me. He started waving his hand, but he didn't move at all and just stood perfectly still. This made me feel uneasy, and I began noticing some strange details. For instance, he was wearing a white overall, which isn't what our crew usually wears. At our company, both officers and crew members have red overalls with silver reflective strips on the shoulders, so seeing him in white felt out of place. On top of that, he had an orange helmet. While we do have a few orange helmets on board, everyone typically wears white helmets, so it didn't make sense for him to be wearing one. And it should have been impossible for him to see me from the front, because all the lights on the bridge were off to avoid glare, and the deck lights were on, which would cause reflections when looking from below. So while this person was standing there waving at me, I felt even more confused. I walked over to the bridge console, grabbed my radio, and tried calling him. I asked if he needed anything, but there was no response. I tried again, but still nothing. He just held up his hand, waving, following me with his head as I moved around the bridge. I first saw him on the starboard side, and the radio was on the port side near the chart table. I tried calling him again, but all I got was static, so I walked over to the light controls, my hands a bit shaky, and turned on the bridge spotlights. The bright lights flooded the entire deck, making everything clear and visible. I looked up from the console and he was gone. I thought maybe he was hiding in the stairway to the paint store or inside the passage to the forward station near the windbreaker. I kept the lights on and waited, hoping to spot him. After about 30 minutes, I decided to turn off the lights but stayed alert, watching for any sign of him. However, I never saw him again. Later, I asked everyone if anyone had been on deck during my watch, but they all said they were asleep, and it seemed like they were telling the truth. Plus, no one even has a white overall. All our overalls are red. It made no sense for anyone to be wandering the deck at 1:30 in the morning. There aren't any scheduled safety rounds, and there's usually no extra lookout awake at that time. Some people thought it might be a prank, but no one knew anything about anyone planning or doing something like this. Even when I asked them to be honest, they said they didn't know. I believed them because there was no reason for them to lie. I wouldn't have been upset if it was a joke. Honestly, they would have pulled off a great prank, and I'd have laughed with them. But no one ever admitted to it, even months later. I also checked the spot where I saw the person, but there was no sign that anyone had been hiding. The stairway to the paint store and the entrance to the bosun store were locked every evening, and they were still locked when I checked them the next morning. So yeah, this was the only weird experience I had in my 5 years of working at sea. And I still can't explain what I saw. I don't think it was a hallucination, because I watched him for at least 5 minutes. I saw him walking forward and then standing there, staring straight at me. I even turned away a few times to grab the radio or walk to the console, but he only disappeared when I turned on the floodlights. The whole experience felt so real. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine and my heart racing, knowing that something just wasn't right. So a few hours ago, something weird happened that I still can't explain. I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, near the coast. My friend told me about a big sea buoy that somehow washed up on the shore, and no one seems to know how it got there, or why it drifted so far from its usual spot. I didn't question it much, but he said he wanted to take some pictures. I hadn't talked to him in a while, because he didn't really like the friends I spent time with. Anyway, school was over for the week, and it was a good time to hang out, so I went along with him. The beach was a few kilometers away, but I thought the walk would be good exercise, so I didn't mind. About 30 minutes later, we met up and walked together for about 45 minutes. We chatted a bit as we walked over the snow and seaweed. Now I should mention that there are many tall towers lining the beach, stretching on for kilometers. But they didn't look like communication towers. My dad works for the military, but he acts strange when I ask about them, almost like he's hiding something, or not telling the whole truth. There was a cliff ahead, so we decided to climb it to get a better view of the beach, and maybe spot the buoy. As we made our way up, we didn't notice that the weather was changing. It got really foggy and cloudy, and there were no birds flying overhead, no animals around, no cargo ships in the distance, like everything was completely still. We didn't realize how strange it was at the time because we were too focused on finding the buoy. When we reached the top, my friend's phone lost connection. It kept freezing and resetting by itself for no reason. He told me that it's a common problem with phones when it gets too cold. We looked around, but we didn't see the buoy or anything alive. So we decided to head back and call it a day. It was getting really cold, and we wanted to get back. My friend tried to take a picture of himself sitting on the cliff before we left, but his phone suddenly died right before I could take the picture. As we were heading back, we saw some light shining through the clouds. It looked really beautiful, so my friend decided to try his phone again and take a picture. Suddenly, I had this strange feeling like someone was watching us, so I turned around and saw a man slowly walking toward us, but for some reason, he was getting closer quickly. I warned my friend that the man had appeared out of nowhere. We would have seen him from the cliff, so there was no way he could have been out of our sight. My friend looked at the man from a distance and then looked at me. He said he couldn't see the man's face. At first I thought he was joking, but then I saw he wasn't lying. Then we heard a loud, terrible screeching sound from beside us. It sounded like a metal saw scraping against a screaming person. We decided to run as fast as we could. After about a minute of running, I looked back and saw the man walking behind the fence. He was technically trespassing because it was military property, but there's no way he didn't know it was trespassing, since there were signs everywhere warning about it. Once he started heading back on the road, away from the beach, my friend's phone started buzzing with notifications from social media. Birds from the ocean returned, flying overhead, and we could see cargo ships sailing all around in the distance. It felt like everything was back to normal. The phone was probably blocked because of the towers. If they were communication towers, they might block phone signals for safety reasons, especially in areas like that. After that strange experience, my friend and I decided it would be best to head home. We didn't want to stay any longer, especially after everything that had happened. We both really wish we had more proof to help explain what happened, but all we have are the details. It's frustrating because without the pictures, it's hard to make sense of it. I don't check my phone much, so I didn't notice right away, but when I finally looked at it, I found that it had broken on its own. It wasn't dropped, and there was no reason for it to stop working.